British author Sir Terry Pratchett made his name and his fortune writing the Discworld fantasy series. Now he's putting his name to a cause that's extremely close to his heart. He suffers from a rare form of Alzheimer's. It's called posterior cortical atrophy. He's still writing. Well, actually he dictates now because PCA affects a person's ability to write. But he's made headlines of his own by promoting the idea of assisted death for people who suffer from degenerative conditions and who want to have a say in when and how they die. He presented his case on BBC TV earlier this year in the annual Dimbleby Lecture. Terry Pratchett, one of the UK's biggest selling writers, has made no secret of the fact he doesn't like journalists pussyfooting around his condition. So I asked him how, after several years of incremental deterioration, PCA is affecting him now.
I certainly don't mind talking about it, because that's why 3 years ago I stood up and said I've got it. Because it's a type of Alzheimer's, a kind of visual Alzheimer's, but all Alzheimer's is not good. And I wanted to make some kind of difference, and if in a small way to help combat the disease. Fortunately for me in my job, and with, I have to say, my money, although the money isn't hugely important at this point, it still leaves me entirely free to work. I work from home. I don't need to drive a car. I can always pay someone to drive a car if I want. And pretty much I can do everything I used to do. It's quite hard for me to differentiate between the condition and what it's like to be 63, which I also am, which perhaps could be forgotten. And indeed, at the moment, I'm putting the finishing touches to the end of the next Discworld book, which will get to my publishers well before Christmas, after I've done several more drafts. And it was only a few weeks ago that I Shall Wear Midnight was on sale here in the UK and I hope in New Zealand.
It is indeed. I have a copy right next to me. You're now, I think, not writing but dictating your book. How do you find that process?
Yes, I find it liberating. I use Dragon Dictate with something called Talking Point, which makes it rather easier to use. And I find talking to the computer is more natural than typing. It does me a lot of good in various ways. One is that, how can I put it? Typing is an overhead. It's something you do. It tires you out. If you're me, I can talk till the cows come home. And if I see I've cast a sentence rather wrongly, I just say, scratch that, and I redo the sentence. And to me, it's of no cost, if you follow me. I haven't wasted any time. I've just been talking. I haven't been banging these old hands on a keyboard. I've just been talking into a microphone.
It sounds like you would have gone for this, you know, if it had been available to you, whatever happened. How fantastic.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, my, if you like, narrative tone of voice suits dictation. I like to tell the story, and it seems to come out very well when I do it like that. So my output with this is faster than it has ever been with a typewriter.
And you've got so many stories to tell. I read somewhere you're going to be working on your autobiography as well, if you can squeeze it in amongst everything else. Is that true?
I had a bit every now and again, but I keep thinking, it's about time I did something interesting, you know?
Characteristically, I've seen some great touches of humour when you've been talking about PCA, and one was that you're handling language really well, but you have to think twice when you put your pants on in the morning. Does having an acute and honed sense of humour, because you do, all these years you've been writing with that beautiful wit of yours, does that help you get through some of the frustrations that must come with this?
Well, at the moment, one of the things that happens is I tend to get recognised a lot more these days, and people come up into the street and say, don't worry, I don't think you've got it. I have trouble putting me pants on. I haven't got anything as far as I know. And, you know, they said, it's just getting old, mate. And I said, well, actually, I've seen the scans. But it is, people rush towards me to say, look, I forget where I left my car keys. I go upstairs and can't remember why I've gone up there. Are you sure you've got something like Alzheimer's? And I say, I've seen the scans. But it's what I've said. I think the idea of a degenerative cerebral disease does frighten people, and they start to lie to themselves sometimes. They get into a state of denial saying that this can never happen to me, and, well, it can.
Does it frighten you, Terry?
Not as much now as it once did. One reason, of course, is that unlike a lot of other people, I had made a lot of money from my books, and that will make the end game, as it were, rather less problematical than it might otherwise be. But you mentioned my sense of humour, and I think I inherited from my father a certain stoicism, and indeed, what it seems to me sometimes is a little fountain of humour that just kind of bubbles up through the stones of despair every now and again. I'll go out in the garden and I'm worried about things, and then I'll find myself humming a tune, and I'll think, why the hell am I being cheerful at the moment? But it seems to break through. It's quite annoying, actually.
Well, I guess there are all sorts of different ways you can react to a diagnosis like this. You can crumble with self-pity, and you can give in, you can accept it, or you can rage against it. And you've spoken about rage. You've spoken about feeling rage.
The rage. I mean, there are two things keep me going. Starting a new book, because the new book, which isn't written yet, there's that blank paper there, or in my case, that blank screen. And so you can write the best book there's ever going to be because you don't have to do it yet. You're just sitting there, so it will be the best book ever. Then there's a bit of hiatus in the middle where you have to do a load of the work. And at the end, you're nearly finishing your book. And that's also great because pretty soon it's going to be finished and the publisher's going to get it and you'll get paid and it's going to get in the bestseller list again. And so you give yourself a lot of highs, which compensates for the occasional lows. And especially since knighthood, I campaign for various things because that is fun, and I campaign generally because I don't like the people on the other side.
Well, you've spoken with genuine puzzlement, it seems to me, that the government in Britain hasn't taken the kinds of steps that you've put forward. And I know in the Dimbleby lecture, I guess 8-9 months ago now, since you put forward your case that I'm going to ask you about now, you've got a new government in. Are they listening to some of those points that you put forward, this idea of having tribunals, this idea of assisted death?
We hope that they are. It's a little-known fact. It's almost a disguised fact that 4 states in America and 4 countries in Europe do allow physician-assisted dying for those who are, as it were, already dying, if you see what I mean. So there are no long and expensive and unpleasant stays over the last years or months. And those who support this here in the UK are very clear that this should not be something that is done without the express permission of the patient at their own wish. I make that absolutely clear. While they're in a fully compos mentis state of mind. I mean, I'm doing this, as it were, in honour of my father, because that's what he said to me. He said, if you see me just lying there with lots of pipes and tubes coming out of me, no good to anybody, I'd like you to tell them to switch me off. And now, I probably would have plucked up the courage. But in those days, I was probably scared of the nurses that were quite big girls.
Yeah, it does seem to me that you've got your dad on your mind with this, because in the end he did have a lingering death, didn't he? I think, was it about a year or so?
It wasn't as bad as many, I have to say. It was, for most part of it, he was okay. But doing the Dimbleby lecture and doing some of the other things I did was actually like getting myself into a copper suit and then standing on top of a hill in a thunderstorm, because I got so many letters from all over the place, and it was amazing how many people in this country absolutely felt the same way. The difficulty is that there are other people that persist in going on about death squads and slippery slopes and so on and so forth. And I just have to keep repeating, this is a democracy. If you actually think that in a democracy, the government will be allowed to march old people into the gas ovens or something, you must be absolutely out of your mind, because nobody's going to vote for it. What we really talk about is, in fact, assisted suicide. And because, as a journalist, I've witnessed, as it were, the aftermath of many suicides, I know how terrible they are. Pierpoint, the last hangman in England, was very good at tying a noose so that people would die almost painlessly. Unfortunately, people who hang themselves in their garage on some electrical wiring do not die like that. I deplore suicide. I do believe, however, that it should be possible for a kindly physician to help, as it were, towards paradise, someone who already has a debilitating, unpleasant, and ultimately deathly condition.
So this idea of a tribunal, how would that work,
Yes.
Terry?
Well, it's kind of an unusual thing, which several, well, myself and the Dignity in Dying people came up with almost the same time. Elsewhere in the world, where physician-assisted dying is allowed, it's all about the physicians, the patient and the physician, and an oversight by other physicians after the event, as it were. If a couple of physicians agree that the patient is indeed in the process of dying, but is in a suitable frame of mind and wishes, as it were, to avoid the worst by leaving early, that can be done. Being English, we thought that perhaps there should be a little more oversight from the community at large. It starts to get rather complicated here, because you may know, and I don't know whether you have the same thing in New Zealand, there have been a number of cases where usually spouses have helped the other member of the marriage who is stricken with something dreadful to commit suicide.
Oh yes, we've had court cases here too, yeah.
Right, and that's caused all kinds of problems, because no judge wishes to bang up some weeping widow who has helped her stricken husband to an earlier death to avoid pain and suffering. They've more or less said, we don't quite think this is what courts are for. And now we have a slightly uneasy, a very English understanding that if a spouse perhaps, or a family friend or someone has tried to persuade someone who has said condition and is firm in purpose and helps them end their life, possibly by mixing the medication or tying a knot or whatever it is, then the law may be lenient with them. It sort of hangs there in the air, and to a lot of us this seems very strange and quite horrible, because how do you prove things? How can the weeping widow, after the death, prove to Mr. Plod, as he clumped in, that she did what she did out of compassion? How can she prove that she had spoken to her husband about the subject many times? You could make it up afterwards if you wanted to kill Granny, to put it at its bluntest. But I hate to have to say it as blunt like that. But to safeguard everybody in all circumstances, we thought that if some small tribunal, and I say non-invasive, I mean, we're not talking about crimes here. We're talking about wisdom and real people and the real fact that lots of people die and lots of them die in ways that we would not like to die in. So that husband and wife or friend, whatever, they can put the state of affairs to a group of citizens who would not actually give them permission, but at least act as some kind of filter. Let me put it like this. Supposing an elderly lady is possessed of a lot of money, and her solicitor will certainly know this, is standing there being rather uncertain with two strapping sons on either side of her saying, well, I've talked to my family and they say perhaps I should, then I think they would say, hang on a minute, we don't like the smell of this. There could be other occasions where such a tribunal could act, if you like, as a long stop, where the social services and what they can do have not been fully explored. For example, I don't know what I would have done if I was unable to write. What I can do, of course, is actually I could dictate to a secretary because I can afford that. But there might be people in despair, and possibly the source of their despair could be somehow ameliorated if the right people understand it and find a way of doing something about it. We're not entirely certain of all the uses this may have. We may find out in the course of time. But we think that possibly there must be an oversight of the doctor-patient relationship on this one to make certain that the people at its worst aren't murdered under the guise of compassion.
How confident are you that this will happen in your lifetime, say?
It depends on the length of my lifetime. I don't know. I have some faith in the wisdom of the common man. I noticed that after the Dimbleby lecture, there was a poll in this country, and more than 90% of people who described themselves as non-religious were in favour of a form of assisted dying, and even 70% of those who did describe themselves as being religious of one sort or another also found in favour. I think governments have to listen to people.
I'm speaking to author Terry Pratchett. Terry, we spoke before about fear. I'm going to ask you about hope, because you've spoken about retaining hope, at least for a treatment to keep you going long enough for a better treatment. As time goes on, is that hope of yours still strong?
Yes, I think so. There is always a kind of hope. And I don't know, for example, once upon a time, I could drive a car. I probably could drive a car now, but when you've got PCA, you might not see the little girl on the brain at the time the little girl is crossing the zebra crossing might not recognize little girl. And in a sense, you will see it, but you won't understand what you've seen. So you can't have that. And I thought losing my driving license, in fact, I voluntarily gave it away the day after I was diagnosed. And I thought, is it going to be the end of the world? And it wasn't. In fact, it isn't the end of the world that I thought it might be. It's something of a release, I have to say.
What's the late? You're on, I think, a relatively new drug. Is that right? Is that giving you hope? How's that working out?
No, there's nothing particularly new with what I've got.
It's just the best available, is it?
Well, yes.
Uh-huh.
We seem to be quite a long way from the magic bottle, which I suspect, if it ever turns up, is very unlikely to turn the clock back. It might just stop it ticking forwards. And I keep my ear to the ground, and I'm not hearing about that at the moment. But I look back at the last few years, and things don't actually seem to have changed all that much. In a sense, sometimes it seems to me that my ability to cope goes faster than the change, because you come up with workarounds, different ways of doing things to get the same effect, and so on.
My understanding is that Alzheimer's research only gets around about 3% of the funding that cancer research gets from the government. Is that likely to change with people like yourself who are out there making this known?
I've heard words from the government. Everybody hears words from the government. And at the moment, there isn't a lot of money around for everybody. So I'm somewhat pessimistic about that. I know there is still research going on. The dreadful thing is that a very large number of people will get Alzheimer's of some kind, dementia of some kind, at some time in their life. If they're lucky, it will be close to the end of their life where, shall we say, it doesn't show up so much. I was in my late 50s when it actually got to the point where it wasn't me feeling a bit offish today or anything like that. I couldn't type so well, and that was the really bad time, when I didn't think there was anything wrong, and I was fighting it all the time and wondering what the hell it was. In a sense, finding out at least put a name to the demon. Once you've learned to speak the demon's name, it loses some of its power on you.
And you've taken control of this. You mentioned before, right at the start of the interview, that you announced this. Now, you could have kept it hidden for a while at least. I think if you and I were doing this interview face-to-face and I didn't know that you had PCA, I wouldn't have the faintest idea. I can tell that from the conversation that we're having. So you did go public.
Young lady, you will never see me put my pants on. I mean, I've always been a fairly hesitant speaker unless I'm actually standing on a stage, in which case what they call Dr. Footlights take over, and I can stand there all night long cracking jokes. But believe it or not, I'm a fairly quiet individual at home. And yes, it is true. In fact, some of my enemies are really the enemies of old people in general. For example, style. Style is a dreadful thing. People take a clock, okay? A clock face, a simple thing. We see them in the nursery school, but they decide to make it look interesting. So whereas with the old type clock, where you just look at it, and there's the time, big hand, little hand, can't do anything about that. You've got to get it right. If you can tell big from small, you know what the time is. Now it's a nice curly clock face with all kinds of wiggly bits on it to make it look exciting, and you have to stare saying, is that 8 o'clock? Lots of problems like that. And of course, toilets. Once upon a time, it said men, women. Now it can say just about anything. You know, especially in the pub, pointers or setters. Which ones are we talking about here? It's fiddly things making what was simple complicated. Oh, and don't get me started on big panes of glass that really stun you when you walk into them.
Oh.
I stayed in a posh hotel with a big shower room, and it had a glass surround. And once you're in the shower, lovely shower. You know, the gravity worked absolutely perfectly. The water kept going down and never came back up. But you turn around, boom, and since I have no hair to speak of, that really hurts. What would be wrong with a little bit of squiggliness so that you could see there was something there? They're the kind of problems, and these are the kind of problems with people with bad eyesight as well, because PCA has some of the sort of symptoms of, well, not exactly blindness, but very bad eyesight.
And I wonder, Terry, for you, is it frustrating or understandable that reviewers and I guess journalists and maybe your fans are now reading your new books like I Shall Wear Midnight and a little bit further ago, Nation, and looking for clues perhaps about how you are dealing with and feeling about PCA. I mean, with Tiffany and I Shall Wear Midnight, you know, she talks about...
Are we going to talk about the book now?
Yeah, she exactly.
Good Lord, let's do that thing, yeah.
But she knows that, and she's a witch, and she's kind of a social worker too. She's lovely. We've been with her for 4 books, and she knows that she can take away physical pain as a witch. Yeah. And she draws it into a ball and then dumps it. But she can't, and you know that even if she could, she wouldn't take away loss and sadness and grief. And that's from your heart?
Yes, of course. What would take the place of grief? You need to do it. You need to get through it. I mean, it would be dreadful. You know, I lost both my parents over a reasonably short span of time, and I loved both of them, and I was an only child. But then it just becomes fond memory. And I think it's a human thing to go through that. If everything that makes you a human being is taken away simply because at that time it's not fashionable, say, then, well, something has gone wrong with the universe. There
are quite shocking elements to this book, which is for young adults and for older readers like myself. It's dark in places. But talking to you, you don't sound to me like you're in a dark place. Is it simply that young people can handle the darker side of life and you shouldn't shy away from it?
Yeah, I mean, there is some really bad stuff in there. Well, some of it bad in some places and macabre in others, especially the old lady and her cat, for example. You must have read that bit.
Yeah, they have a taste for her, really.
That was based on a real thing. In fact, that sort of thing is not unknown to social workers. The other thing, because I write for adults and I write for children, and I have got 2 very good children's book editors who keep their fingers on the pulse. And when I was writing this book, I said, look, there is some kind of serious stuff that we would think of as, I suppose, modern now in the book. And they read it and said, yeah, I think you're a bit behind the times. She said, in young adult fiction now, you'd be amazed at what you can mention and what you can deal with, because the kids now aren't the same kids as you and I were when we were kids. They grow up a bit earlier, they see what's on the news, they read the papers, and fortunately, though there is darkness in places in I Shall Wear Midnight, in my hands, you can guarantee that there is a dawn.
The scene where the Baron dies with Tiffany, I can't help but read that and be moved by that. And it reflects some of the things that you and I have been talking about over the last half hour, in essence, that the Baron, he's had all the reassurances, but what he really wants from Tiffany is the truth. So he knows what's coming. I do love the conversation about death, because we love death in capital letters. He's been a constant in your books. And I guess we'd all like to think that a scythe-bearing skeleton who's a really good guy and in fact very humane will come and shake our hands and take us somewhere at the end of the day. What do you think will greet you and me and all of us when we pass?
I have no idea. Well, the Western world at least has less acquaintanceship with death than it used to. In Victorian England, you were very lucky indeed if you grew up without a brother or a sister dying, and probably several. And I've seen very many Victorian pictures and even photographs of Grandad dying and the whole weeping family around the bed. And one can be almost certain a friendly doctor with the morphine or whatever it is, making certain that he did die without screaming. I've discussed lots of things with old midwives and doctors and read many medical books on the subject. We have shoved death into the hospital now, which makes kids worried because they think you're going to the hospital to die. I wasn't there when my mother died, so they phoned me up when it was happening, and we had to drive through the most tremendous rainstorm to get there. And in a way, I have to say, there are people who will understand this. I was glad that she died, because she'd had a massive, massive stroke which was tearing her to pieces. And I think the hospital kindly let her die quietly and without pain. And I felt happy that that had happened, because she wasn't lying around for a very long time in some kind of strange netherworld. We have to be a matter of fact about the fact that we have a lifespan and it ends, and we can have it the easy way or we can have it the hard way. And the easy way is to accept that you die, make proper provision, and die as quietly and comfortably as possible.
Sir Terry Pratchett. His latest novel is called And I Shall Wear Midnight, and it's published by Doubleday, and he tells me that he plans to come to New Zealand and Australia early next year.